This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And it's an interesting weekend. The Rattlesnake Master Run for the Prairie is on right now. And they sometimes get, I think, perhaps 300 people. We started off with the first 7 years, I don't know, they've been running it for quite a while. They do a very good job and bring in money for prairie preservation, folks. And so you be supportive. A whole bunch of volunteers over there. The farmers market had the last event. I was walking around, talking to people, and I ended up with a pumpkin. And I thought that was a rather interesting pumpkin. We could even get it closer to the camera to see what the pumpkin is like. It's just got nice artistic sort of things, which I like to see a lot. I keep pumpkins around. We've had one outside WEFT for a whole year. They last, and they're very healthy. So,
we might mention to folks, you've just mentioned a camera. Most people who are at home listening right now are saying, wait a second, this is the radio, what is that? So we might want to point people out to the to YouTube. This is an experiment that's been going on for over a month now. If you're listening at home right now, you can certainly enjoy the next hour of the Prairie Monk. If you ever miss this program, or if you hear us talking about stuff and you're wondering it doesn't quite come through to you, we've gone back afterward. There are now videos on YouTube for the last, this is the 5th week now, I believe, of the Prairie Monk as video. So if you go to youtube.com and in their search window you type in the Prairie Monk, the word "the" actually helps just a little bit. You can actually find all of the programs for the videos of these last 5 programs of the Prairie Monk online. So you can actually see the gourd, the pumpkin that he's actually holding up in the studio.
We're also streamed on computer. So if you want to follow us with maps and charts and things like that, you can do so on the computer. You can Google up satellite photographs and things like that. So this is a very interesting experiment. I'm very appreciative of the Urbana Television, Public Television Group, and we thank you very much for doing this. Speaking of vernacular things, we have an idea store. The idea store is an idea store that has all sorts of little bits and pieces that have come through from various people who have excess boxes or charts or fabrics or all sorts of things. So they're going to have a trash art fair that will come up in March, but you have to start thinking about registering it now. So I bought 2 or 3 pieces of vernacular art. Sometimes they actually are good for noise and music, but this is a fellow. You see, he was an exhaust pipe. He looks like a guy, and he sits in my window, and people look at him and say, "Hi," and here we have a dragon that sort of appeared out of nowhere. It's just been out of a piece of scrap steel, and it looks rather wonderful. So it sits in the front of my shop too. And we encourage people to come with their vernacular art. It has to be 75% recycled. So think about that. And yeah, it was Folk and Roots Festival, and I think it's still on. So David, say something about that. You had a mouth organ.
Yes, harmonica as we call it around here. Yes, right, exactly. Sure. In fact, it's essentially over now. It's weird. I would have thought it would have gone all through the entire weekend as well, but it actually got started Thursday night at Cranard, and then Friday and Saturday mainly it was in downtown Urbana. Basically, most of the venues that you would normally go to for where you'd ever hear live music, like the Iron Post, they were taken over for this festival because they decided this year and for last year also, they would move all of the musical events indoors so they didn't have to worry about weather problems. And besides having music performances, they also had lots of workshops. And since I've been an avid harmonica player for the whole 4 years now that they've actually had this music festival in downtown Urbana. I've gotten to teach anyone who I could get a harmonica into the hands of how to play the harmonica and basically show them. Not only is it a really simple folk instrument where you can play children's songs, over the years people have found fun other ways that you can use the harmonica to do things. For example, one prominent way of using the harmonica these days is to play the blues, and you don't even have to know why it works the way it does. You can take the simple instrument that plays my hat, it has 3 corners, and if you just move around to a slightly different position on the harmonica, start playing and stop playing at a different place, suddenly you get a much more bluesy sound out of the harmonica. And so Doug Schroer, one of the top harmonica players in town here, and I we ended up spending an hour and a half. Our workshop only lasted for 45 minutes, but he and I didn't want to stop, and no one felt like leaving, so we just did an additional 45 minutes of teaching folks how to play that simple little instrument.
That's fun.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It really is.
Thank you. And it's something you can put in your pocket. Not all harmonicas are small. Some of them are large.
This is true. Doug actually has a rather large chromatic harmonica it's like having 2 harmonicas fastened together into the same chassis with a button to alternate between the 2 of them. And so, yeah, it would be hard to fit one like that into a pocket.
Yes. So I was distributing T-shirts for Heartland Pathways. I had offered people shirts which are rather popular, and so I had another run done this week, and I distributed some of those. But it's an interesting farmers market. Well, without further ado, we want to go back to Heartland Pathways. We've been trying to give you some idea of what Heartland Pathways is about, and so we dealt with one of the legs, Seymour to Whiteheath, just recently, and so we're going to deal with another leg, which is between Monticello and Cisco today, and then later we'll deal with another 23 miles that goes west from Whiteheath to Clinton and Weldon Springs, and so there are 3 legs, not necessarily contiguous, but contiguous with other activities that are kind of nice. Like this one will deal with the Historic Railroad Museum, which abuts to our territory. We have 4 miles from Seymour to Whiteheath. The Champaign end is a short line of 9 miles, so you go Seymour, bed available, and then at Whiteheath the railroad has a tri-fid railroad line. You can go to Clinton or you can go to Decatur. The Railroad Museum has 7 miles of railroad bed between Whiteheath and Monticello. It also owns an interurban which is parallel, so that before the main line was closed out, the interurban was used for a railroad experience. Now the main line is used. There's the piece between Whiteheath and Nelson's Crossing, which is the 4 miles downhill over the Cerro Gordo moraine. So it's kind of rolling and nice, but as yet not as used as often as the 3 miles between Nelson's Crossing and Monticello. There are a depot at both ends, so people going to the Monticello Railroad Museum get an experience which is unique. It's probably a national level experience. They have a lot of rolling stock. The interurban that's parallel is used for storage at the moment of rail cars, but it could be an electric line that parallels the main line. It could be that we would have trails on that site too. In the long run, the Railroad Museum has become an icon for tourism in Monticello. It's rather popular. I watched the other day that they were putting together a ghost train with 5 passenger cars and a slug which provides electricity, and kind of nice. I didn't stay for the event, but I have been there before. It's just a fun experience for Halloween. So the Railroad Museum extends on 3 miles into Monticello. It mostly runs with antique diesel equipment, but it also has spent 15 years restoring a steam engine that is now functional, and so there's a pride owner. It's not run all the time. It's rather expensive on oil. They changed from coal to oil, but it's an experience to hear it go while sitting there waiting. The condensers are going while you're standing there alongside it, and you have to realize these big pistons are going to push those wheels around, and it can go at quite a tremendous pace. We were recently at Tolono looking at a steam engine that came through at really a rapid pace.
I need to jump in with actually now 2 things. There was a woman that we met at Tolono who introduced herself to me because she was at the festival yesterday afternoon. I went to one of the workshops where they teach you how to play guitar, and I learned how to play a song on the guitar in just 45 minutes. And this woman turned to me and said, "I haven't seen you for a while. How have you been?" And it turned out it was one of the people who met with us when the steam engine came through in Tolono. Now, something that I had never actually thought about when for example, when I have my toy train when I was a kid, you've got wheels of different sizes on a steam engine, and they're not all directly involved in making the train move. Could you take just a couple of seconds to point out that where the piston is actually connected and what the purpose is for the other wheels if they aren't actually like car wheels that are intended for, like moving?
There is a bogie in the front usually that sometimes it moves so that it can go around corners and things like that. So it holds up some of the weight to the front of the engine. And the pistons are usually along the side. In some cases where you're in mountains, and you're going over a hill, and that would bend that sort of parallel thing, the pistons are vertical, so they can move independently. But mostly they're along the side, and there's usually one big drive wheel, but over the years that modernized and got to be several drive wheels linked together. And they move slowly as you let steam into a cylinder, and then there's a oscillating valve which lets it release and go again, release and go again. And the released steam is condensed in a condenser, which is the thing you hear when the engine is stopped at a railroad station. So it's just condensing the water and preserving it. It has a big firebox, and the firebox is heavy, and the water moves through the firebox on pipes. And the steel that holds it up is often about 1 inch thick. Wow. And very, very, very heavy. So when you're talking about a steam engine, you're talking about a heavy engine. More modern diesel engines have more wheels, and it's powered by electricity. There's a motor. So you have a motor that's on the engine which generates electricity, and it's easier to handle the electricity than to have the motor working on the wheels. So you can gradually get a rheostat and it goes, and your engine is moving ahead. And those engines are less prone to break rails when they hit the end of them if you go push down one. So yes.
So the wheels are lighter because you're spreading out the whole effort over more wheels. It's something else I'd never thought about until you brought it up. Steam engines, you've got the power going directly from the steam to drive the wheels. In the diesel motor, what the motor is actually doing is it's powering up a battery, and then the battery in turn is powering the wheels themselves. So you've got an extra step of conversion in there. Never thought about that before.
Very large motors. And so you can have several motors underneath the diesel engine. But some of the steam engines, the one we saw at Tolono, were even better than some of the first diesel motors. But diesel has won out in the long run. And it's more convenient to have a diesel motor. With coal is very expensive. and it has a pollution factor to it too. So, yeah, the Railroad Museum has trains regularly into Monticello, and they have a depot there. The Wabash Depot moved to the site, and countless visitors and locals have enjoyed going to the Railroad Museum. It's sort of a hub. The Railroad Museum has it owns the parallel interurban, but from on the city side, the city has bought a couple of miles into Monticello, and on that they have an asphalted trail, which is kind of nice. And at the start of it, there is a Dyson flag stop. It's the sort of place where you would put your hand up and stop the interurban, the little two-car event. The driver would stop for you and pick you up. And there's a little concrete spot, and the Boy Scouts have been restoring that. But it's on the rail trail, which is an asphalted trail for bicycles, and they're riding along parallel to the Railroad Museum train. So kind of interesting. When you get to Monticello, there's a depot there, and the line actually extends a little past Monticello, and there is a Y there, just the same as there is a Y at Whiteheath, which allows the train to go in different directions. And in this case, the Railroad Museum has a connection with a main line, Norfolk Southern line, that goes to Chicago. So the Railroad Museum trains can actually go onto the main line and go to Decatur and provide an experience for people who are interested in railroad there. So it's not confined to just this location, but if you do go in that manner, you have to have a railroad engineer that's used to the line to be the supervisor of that event. But there's quite a few people who are enjoying that sort of experience in retirement and before retirement. One of the people driving the engine the other day was a woman, and there's very few women who drive engines, and she's quite excited to do that. She's passed all the engineering qualifications to be able to do that. Getting back to the trail at the other end of the Railroad Museum, it comes to a halt, and we get to be contiguous with the trail from the west side of Monticello, where there's a sanitary treatment plant, but that's just so that you can locate the place. The city has bought from us an easement, a permanent easement for a mile, which goes over some of the morainic material, across the Sangamon River, and over again a piece of moraine and some lowland that's rather wonderful, and onto County Farm Road. And it's just a mile, but it's rather wonderful. It brings together the people that are on the west side, the subdevelopments that are on the west side with Monticello. They can ride their bicycle, walk across the bridge, and it's not only convenient, but it's also ambient. You can stand and look down the river and look up the river. You can hear the frogs croaking in the lowlands nearby, and it's just rather wonderful. It allows you to get to County Farm Road, and that road extends into Allerton Park, so you have contact with other open spaces. So our territory, if restored and implemented into a trail, activates other sites, so they live off of each other and increase their opportunity to provide some service to people. Just recently, the Allerton Park Bridge has been restored. So those contacts make for us to have trails that might be on rails or on rail bed or on roads. Like if you need to get to Whiteheath, you might have to ride a road as well as on a rail trail. But altogether, we're hoping that one day we'll dream that the Railroad Museum steam engine can get into Champaign. That means we have to think about how we can put in an adjacent trail. It just preserves the biodiversity, and just this is sort of what we did when we bought the line in the first place. We're dreaming of these sorts of things, and it's taken 30 years to happen, but it's happening. Unfortunately, the trestle, that long approach trestle to the bridge, suffered from a typical accident which occurs around July 4th celebration times. People get hold of the fireworks, and the fireworks get to be displayed before the festival day. And they caught the grass afire, and the grass caught the bridge afire, and there was some of the bridge was demolished. They sort of know who did it, and so the children involved will be doing some penance for doing this, but the bridge has now been restored, and so as of now you can go back across the bridge, and it's a rather popular trail.
This might be worth pointing out a detail. This is what Heartland Pathways exists for. It's not as though this railway was sitting there unused, and then all of a sudden Monticello said, hey, you know what? This mile here would be perfect for us to put a rail trail on. Heartland Pathways, you spent some time beforehand trying to convince them to do something with this, didn't you?
Yes, we didn't always get funding to buy. That was the difficult. 30 years ago when we wanted to buy this, that wasn't thought to be a good idea. But now there are like 1,700 trails like this around the universe. And I just ran into someone the other day, and they said, you know, I have a relative in Chicago, and there are these rail trails everywhere. Why is it that we can't have something the same? And that's sort of what we're talking to the public about, and that's why we're putting stuff up on YouTube, so that people know about this resource and we don't lose it to farmers before we've got to do something ourselves. And it preserves the biodiversity.
That's one of the advantages in my mind. First of all, this would be a good time to point out the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers, and WEFT does not take an editorial stance. So Heartland Pathways is there because the average person can't be everywhere, can't think of everything. So you've got groups like Heartland Pathways to be there, getting donations from individuals, and we're getting grants and whatever, to be there to take care of things, and then hopefully more people come along and make contributions later to help keep the organizations there. And this is my unsubtle way of mentioning to folks that if you haven't contributed to WEFT, for us to be here, likewise, we need to hear from you folks to make contributions to keep WEFT on the air, just as Heartland Pathways can of course, use its own contributions. If you can make a contribution here today, when we're finished talking at noon, you can certainly give us a call here at 359-9338, and we can take your pledge. Thanks to Sue, by the way, who called right after last week's show and made a pledge after we mentioned that you can certainly become a member of WEFT. Likewise, at noon, then you can try again and get through to us. And without even waiting for us to finish this program, you can go to our website, WEFT.org, and to make a contribution that way.
It's very important. It's not easy to get for financial support for talk programs, more for music, and WEFT does wonderful variety of music, and so yes, please support. But in the background, we want you to understand what Heartland Pathways is about, and in turn, we will want you to support Heartland Pathways. And that's what David helps me with a lot, is the computerization of this information. So we will take today's radio program and drop pictures into it that will let you understand what we're doing visually. So now you're at the western end of 7 miles of active railroad museum territory. So, and then you have a mile of city-built trail that goes to County Farm Road. There's another 5 miles that goes to Cisco, and we are hoping to resurrect a trail on 5 miles of that. It went to a road cut. We weren't awfully excited about having a road cut from a subdevelopment into old Route 47, because it sort of cut across our long, narrow railroad habitat, and a long, skinny trail like that is not an ideal habitat, but it's all we have, folks. So we did a little battle about that, and we kind of lost, and we have a road cut called Applewood, and that's okay. We start there, and from there to Cisco, the 100-foot of railroad bed is alive with prairie. It's not God's greatest prairie, but it is prairie. In some places it's a very good prairie. In some places we've had it dug up because, like recently we had a replacement of culverts, and without knowing the value of it, the contractor put the leftovers from the retired culvert on top of a very good prairie, and we were disappointed by that, and we asked the Department of Transportation to give us $8,000 to try and remove the soil that's on that very, very good prairie. It has things like hoary puccoon and a real range of prairie. We don't always win, but that site could be a trail that goes all the way to Cisco. It goes past Armenia, and Armenia is where Mr. Allerton came from, Armenia in New York, and so that's how Armenia got its name. There's an elevator there that's on our railroad bed that we hope will be retained as a historic monster, and we've had grad students out there with landscape architecture, experimental things that relate to the elevator, because it's made, their sculpted piece was made out of elevator wood. So these things all add up to awareness of this corridor and the fact that it's biodiverse. The corridor carries some rattlesnakes. They're eastern Massasaugas, and they're rather quiet rattlesnakes. They're not ones that will come after you. You could almost sit on top of them and they won't bite you. If you annoy them, they might do that. But the way they're found by researchers, that you put an 8-foot by 4-foot sheet of plywood down, and mice come to that site to protect themselves over winter, and the snakes come to the mice and settle underneath the board. That means if you're a snake person, a herpetologist, you have a pointed stick that you can put over the snake's head, and you gradually push the snake's tail into a plastic tube and out the other end, so that you can put a computer chip in the snake's tail, and then you can follow the life history of that rattlesnake with a fishing rod with a microphone on the end of it, or some such similar device. The university has been interested in those rattlesnakes and their possible increase, so they've given conservationists 66 feet by a mile to create a prairie, which is sown grasses, which will grow from seed fairly easily, plus about 1,500 3-year-old broadleaf plants. So after 5 years, that prairie looks just like a prairie, and we're hoping it looks like a prairie for the rattlesnakes that would find a new home there and expand. There's been a tendency to dig up everything, so sometimes the creatures that are along our railroad bed are only in that site and not anywhere else. The soils, for example, are herbicided and chemicalized out of existence. They're not natural anymore. Not that the soils don't change over the years, but we try to be back to an era that was before settlement to show people what a prairie was like. When you go past Wildcat Creek and past Armenia and past Willow Branch, there we extend towards Cisco. At Cisco, the railroad bed becomes active. It was not abandoned. It becomes a short line railroad, into Decatur. I think the distance is about 18 miles. And if you're a bicyclist, that's probably pretty rideable corridor. The railroad came first, and the roads parallel the railroad. So old Route 47 goes all the way in from Cisco, or from Monticello actually, all the way to Decatur. Interestingly, Interstate 72 has been built parallel again, but further to the west. And that has taken most of the traffic that came along on old Highway 47. So now that makes Highway 47 a kind of lightly used corridor that's good for bicycling. So we hope to get into Decatur there. So think of Decatur on one end, Champaign on the other end, Champaign to Danville if we get the 24 miles in that direction. And then at Whiteheath you can go to Clinton, 23 miles through Lodge, DeLand, Weldon, Lane, Weldon Springs State Park, and Clinton. So we want you to know about this site because it's really wonderful. If you just add up the price, the value of the territory, some of the agricultural land is going up to as much as $12,000 an acre. If you say that we only, ours is only worth $5,000 because we've got some creosote and some old steel ties and things like that on it, so it's downgraded in its price some. We still have 33 miles of railroad bed, and if it's 100 feet wide, it's like 12 acres to the mile. And if you multiply that by $5,000, you have a lot of real estate. So for people who are interested in trails and rails and things like that, this is a tremendous resource, a very valuable resource. One of our problems is we do not have the day-to-day money to functionally supervise 33 miles of railroad bed that are out of town by 30 miles in some cases. So we're struggling at this end to keep it afloat. But one of the reasons why we have YouTube is that we need to get this out to people. And we've been very pleased to look at the response from the YouTube hits that we're getting. It's obvious that people are reading our YouTube information, and the visuals help. So we'll be doing more of that, and perhaps we'll even be putting out a fundraising brochure sometime in the future. I think that probably gets some of my concern. I think we might return from Cisco and go to Whiteheath, where there's this tri-fid line. It's like a triangle. One leg goes to Champaign, one leg goes to Decatur, the other leg goes to Clinton. And we will go down to Shady Rest. Shady Rest is a 30-acre park which is now in the perpetual care of Piatt County Forest Preserve. And then we go over the Sangamon River, over a number of little creeks that come into there, Madden Creek, and then we go up to Lodge and over rail road that's very active going to Chicago. And if you have imagination, and if it came to be 50 years from now, and if you wanted to do a circuit on the Railroad Museum, you could go from the Railroad Museum, Nelson Crossing Station, you go up the hill to Whiteheath, down to Shady Rest, over the Sangamon River, over Madden Creek, up to Lodge. And then these elevators are 5 miles apart, Lodge and DeLand, Weldon, Lane, and into Clinton. we need people to think and dream about those territories. So let's start at Shady Rest. It's 30 acres, which was on the banks of the Sangamon, and people went there to picnic. They could take a horse and cart from Champaign or Decatur and go to the site and have a picnic. As cars came to town, and as people came back from World War II, having driven tanks and things like that, they were more prone to buy automobiles and go to Colorado to ski or do other things. But this was a fine picnic ground. It had little houses on it that were weekenders that you could rent, 10 or 15 in a row. The trees are very indicative of the fact that this was a very much a picnic area. So you have big trees and little trees. The little trees are recent trees. The big trees were trees that were there when it was a picnic ground. No middle trees because they were cleaned out so people could have a picnic ground. So a forester looking at this area can look at the site and say, picnic ground. And then we go past Shady Rest, which is on the banks of the Sangamon. There's an attempt to have the Sangamon River have sites all the way along that are preserved on the banks. Sometimes that's flatland, sometimes it's where a lake bursts through the moraine. Sometimes it's very fast and has high banks, and sometimes it's very flat and soupy. So you can't grow corn and soybeans on it. It's too damp. You're talking about the festival in Urbana being indoors. Well, this time of the year you have rain in the spring and rain in the fall and drought in the summer. So that was a sensible move. And so we have the same problem with our trails. It goes through little towns. We didn't buy the elevator plots because they were useful to the elevators. So the grain that's stored in the old railroad elevator is now brought in and taken out by semi-trailer. And I doubt if ever there will be a return to railroading. That does happen in some cases, and as the price of railroading gets to be more efficient, we talk about 1 ton of freight, 1 gallon of gas, 500 miles. You're talking about efficiency that you don't have out of a semi-trailer that chugs along at 4 to 6 miles a gallon. So that sometimes that happens. I don't think that will ever happen here. So we have the possibility of a trail all the way through, and that's a nice feeling. 5 miles of this trail joins Weldon Springs State Park and Clinton Power Plant Lake. But in order to do that, you have to be in competition with the adjacent owners who are not so sure about your wanting to have your prairie weeds and seeds adjacent to the cornfield. There's a fear that some of the insects, the 2,000 different species of insects, will hover over your corn and soybeans and bring in disease. So it is better if that area were mown. So sometimes it gets mown. But that is not exactly true. The research shows that if you encourage the insects and the like, they don't move into something that's a monoculture that has its own particular insects, and they're not the ones that are in the prairie. So we have a lot of educating to do to say to people, this weeds is deleterious. No. These weeds are saving our biodiversity. These things are the biochemicals that you will need in the future. We have destroyed practically all the arable land in the Prairie Peninsula, and we need these little pieces to keep our genetics afloat. So that's what we have to do, and we have to have various methods to do that. I was interested just recently to learn about, I think it was Decatur, or someone had a competition for people who are local to recognize prairie plants, which is kind of a joke because most people don't know diddly about what a prairie plant is, but it's getting better. The Grand Prairie Friends is very good at it. The rattlesnake master run that they're wearing today will give out plants and awards that photographs or drawings or what have you that are associated with a prairie, and that's getting the message around. So that's what we're after with this sort of programming. When it gets to Lane and you have another river system, it's the Salt Creek, and it's been dammed up for the nuclear power plant for a cooling lake. So the temperature of the water in that lake is about 3 degrees higher than the normal temperature of any other lake that would be in the area. So the species are different, but fishermen can go there and enjoy, boaters can go there. It did inundate various farmlands, so there was a lot of opposition to that going in there, and it was going to have a second nuclear power plant, and I think that has been curtailed. But it's there, and the creek lets out water, and where the water comes out, there's often fish that come out of the lake, and there are often eagles around to take advantage of that site. So kind of interesting area. Go over a truss bridge and up the hill and into past Weldon Springs and into Clinton. So that's what we want you to know about. So somewhere in here we'll put in some idea of the biodiversity. We have to make sure that like at Monticello we have prairie on the railroad bed, but we're adjacent to the road, and in the fall, early fall, the road was alive with 2 plants that are introduced plants. One is chicory, which was used for coffee, to dilute coffee when you didn't have a lot of coffee, or to give it a sort of bitter taste that was enjoyed by especially Southerners. So that gives a blue hue to the roadside until noon, and then it slackens off. It flowers early in the day. And behind that, in a slightly more moist situation, is Queen Anne's lace, which is a beautiful flower that's introduced, and it's flat, and you can put it in a book and squeeze the pages together and give it to your friend as a little memento. And it's just a wonderful umbellifery plant that belongs to the umbrella family. So the flowers are an umbrella with a little umbrella on top of that and another little umbrella, so it's umbellifery. So that's tremendous. And it goes down into the ditch, up the side, and onto our prairie. There's a tremendous tendency to, after August the 1st, to mow that rather beautiful material and to destroy it before it's finished flowering for the season. If you mow on August the 1st, you're going to get a lot of the late season bloomers, and you get the prairie plants that haven't seeded yet, and you get our harvest opportunity. So we're rather jealous of no-mow policies along those sites. I'm just looking at my notes here to see what...
Musical break?
Yes, a little bit of music would help.
And Dave's current favorite is the Duke of Uke. I didn't see them there at the festival this weekend. However, there were plenty of chances for you to learn to play the ukulele, and there were in fact some performances where lots of school children had learned to play the ukulele, and they were playing We Shall Overcome and lots of Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan type songs, even some Beatles tunes. So here's a track, part of a track, about a minute or so I suppose, of a song from the Duke of Uke from their most recent album called April's Empire. You're tuned to WEFT Champaign. Do.
And we're back again.
Oops, sorry.
And we're back again. What I would like to say is, how do you handle this sort of thing? When we purchased, we were purchasing rough and tough. We had to handle different titles. There are very good titles like warranty deeds, but then there are easements of various types. Some are stronger than others, and there are adverse possessions where the railroad just took over land without asking anyone, and these and there are reversionary clauses in some of these sites. We've gathered up the prairie knowing the problems we have, but we've been very pleased with farmers generally who have been adjacent and kept us, and they say to us, you have the right to do what you've done. We could have bought this territory. They had the right to buy it just as we did. And so we like what you're doing. Some people are very aware of the biodiversity that we're saving. Mm-hmm. And I sort of use the visual of an arrow. We're working on the end of the arrow, the tip of the arrow, where we don't have a lot of rules of the game, and we're just doing it by the seat of our pants, which is a little bit loose for the acquisition of land. So the next step is to take that from raw purchase to a community non-profit agency which has various rules of the game and various strictures, then to the creation of a group like the Grand Prairie Friends, which gets to be more formal, has the backing of people from the Natural History Survey, has state recognition as people who are able to go for grant money. Then this next level is a tax base that where you assign that corridor to a county or a forest preserve or some agency like the state that will keep this bed in perpetuity. All those steps require a more serious involvement of care. It involves fairly strict taxation laws. If you have a 501c3, you are not allowed to be political about this, but you are allowed to talk to people, and people get a tax break from donating. But that should be understood. We're still at the very front edge of this arrow. We hope that it will get to the state level. And the state has looked at 5 miles between Weldon Springs and the Clinton Power Plant Lake, and they've looked at the titles, and they feel that it's an area we could acquire. The next thing is, how do you acquire that? Well, the state is kind of broke, so and the federal government is kind of broke. So the next thing is to look at groups of conservation people, like the Friends of Weldon Springs, for instance, the Friends of the Sangamon River, to acquire things like the area behind White Heath, which is known as Shady Rest. So you look for groups of people who have the ability to take the corridor to the next step. And you also need to have resources to work with now. If we need to put up a fence, we have to have fence posts, and we have to have a place to do it. If we are going to work with students that make landscape sculptures for the Havana Land Arts group, we need space, and we need the storage of equipment. In our case, we don't have money for fancy equipment, folks, so we have old vehicles, and we have old equipment that's recycled, and that helps. So we can have 42 people at Rantoul, and we have these other spin-off areas where we care for, like Lake Park and Rantoul Pope Prairie and Arcola, a small prairie, and those places, not our territory, but we work with them, and you need a base. So we've been very glad to have to rent a fairly large warehouse at Bonneville that helps us to do these sorts of things. What we have to do is find the funding to pay that sort of rent, and be able to go to it with a pickup truck, pick up 25 shovels or post drivers or other things that we need. Sometimes it has to be motorized equipment, and so we have to have people who can use a chainsaw without hurting themselves, to be able to go out there and take out Russian olives, or autumn olives as they're called. We need to be able to have people who understand the complexity of this. I was talking to someone last night, and we talked for 3 hours about this sort of interaction. How do we know people? So you go to people like the independent media, and you let people know what your resource is. You go give talks. You run, like we did, reading the landscape class at Parkland College, which eventually has morphed into recognition at the university level with a natural history master's program, and a gardener's program. And so gradually you have that sort of influence that allows us to move the idea steadily. If it's on the Urbana side to Danville, we have managed to register for a more recent project, which was interim trail use. So we registered for that, and that generated $400,000 for planning, and now it has gained enhancement money for the possible buying of that corridor, which amounts to $900,000. So some of the things we do in the loosey-goosey side of manner in the first place have resulted in quite a lot of benefits. They're very hard to define, But they depend on people knowing each other, talking to each other, going to city meetings, creating sculpted statements, talking to people who might be involved in things like water and moraines and aquifers, and talking about coal and coal mining and how that relates to all these sorts of things. So it's a huge sort of interaction. But remember that there is a resource that's worth many thousands of dollars, and when developed, it could be a multi-million-dollar event. So we want to alert people to the fact that we're doing this quietly, but you need to know what we're doing and perhaps be able to help us. And some of the help can be taking out trees or doing something very manual, or picking seed, or sorting seed, or distributing seed, or digging in plants, or protecting, or just walking along the corridor says to someone, why is this person walking along the corridor? Why are they interested? We have to do that. But the most of the difficult thing is to know the mental part of it. How do we go to an attorney that is a land attorney to challenge someone who might be invading our territory? This is sort of where we have to spend like $270 an hour to ask this sort of question. And we have to know the people and places, and that includes the small communities. We have to go to the village board and talk to people who don't even know that we own the corridor. They think it still belongs to the railroad bed in some cases. So we have to go to Farmer City or Weldon or Lane and other places and just tell people what we're doing. So think about us, get a hold of us. Our telephone number is 351-1911, or my cell phone is 840-1911. And remember that we have an email, monkdavid0@gmail.com, and you can call me or write me and I'll try to contact you. We've spread kind of thin, but we'll try to make that contact. So we've come
Sorry,
to the end of our time, and so this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.